Hello and welcome to Bury Our Bones with Cinema, the podcast that lives, breathes and dies both classic movies and those that we much rather forgot ever existed. In today's episode, we take a welcome venture into the wilderness that is sequels that surpass the original. So sit back with a nice cold carbonated drink, an oversized bowl of the devil's sorted popcorn, and prepare to feel relaxed in the knowledge that a number 2 doesn't always mean what you think.
JML teleporters, bang, and the fly is gone.
As mentioned in the intro, we are going to be looking today at sequels that surpassed the original. Now, they are very few and far between, as we know from the past couple of episodes, that sequels are often very, very difficult to navigate. But in this episode, we're going to be looking at, in my opinion, a couple of movies that surpass the original. You know, those movies that actually take what we loved about the original and succeed our expectations and do something better and progress the story, progress the characters, progress many, many different things. As I say, they are very few and far between, but there are some out there. It's not all doom and gloom when it comes to sequels. A couple of honourable mentions before we get into the crux of the two films that I want to be talking about. Obviously, I mentioned it on numerous episodes of our podcast, but The Dark Knight, obviously covered that in an episode in season 1. Go and check it out. But it essentially raises the stakes from Batman Begins. It takes the character that we built up in that first Nolan movie and it takes it to another level. Nothing to do with Dane Bowers, but it takes it to another level and we look at what we love about that character, what we love about that world and that universe. As I say, it takes the stakes and raises them slightly and gives us an iconic an iconic look into the Joker character that we didn't think we would get post Jack Nicholson. Again, another comic book movie that surpasses the original, Spider-Man 2. Tobey Maguire, Alfred Molina, Kirsten Dunst, Sam Raimi direction. Again, another great sequel, another great iteration in the Spider-Man series before it decided to go emo Spider-Man in the third film. Another film that raises the stakes, another film that puts the characters that we love in more peril than we've seen them before, and an interesting deep dive into relationships for Peter Parker in that second movie, more so than we'd already seen in the first film. It took everything we kind of loved about the first film and it just built upon it. It didn't throw everything away. It built upon what we loved in that first film. And I think that's kind of going to be a running theme in this episode, is that the sequels that are great, that follow what we like, builds on the stuff that was made in that first movie or in that first iteration. It doesn't take what we loved and kind of unnecessarily change things, doesn't decide to just scrap rules that were made in the first film, doesn't decide to take our goodwill for granted. It actually builds upon it. And so the first film that I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail is what I thought was quite highly regarded as a sequel, but actually having done a bit more research, finding out that actually it's not as highly regarded as I once thought. But for me, I always thought this was a marginally better sequel in Blade 2. Now, the first Blade is a fantastic first iteration for that Wesley Snipes interpretation of the Blade character. You know, he is the epitome of cool in that first 2 minutes of that first film. You know, that rave kind of scene, and you know that kind of edginess that we see in those opening scenes of that first film. You know, it has a fantastic soundtrack. You know, that really adds to the vibe and the character. You know, he's dangerous, but he's cool. He's a little bit edgy. He's a little bit dangerous. You know, he's not 100% a good guy, but we know he's not a bad guy. It has good supporting characters. With Whistler, played by Chris Christopherson, you know, builds a solid foundation for what we know we can build upon in the second film. It's got some awesome fight scenes, some fantastic fight scenes that really kind of showcase the ability of Wesley Snipes and the characters and performers in that first film. And it's laced with some great humour. You know, that gluttonous or almost Jabba the Hutt style vampire in the first film, where it has a bit of a squeaky, over the top voice. You know, when he's interrogating him, you know, that's a funny scene, and also it's just some you know some really cool one-liners from Wesley Snipes in that first film that doesn't get corny. It's just shows you a little bit of the character. The only criticism that I would have with that first film is that the main antagonist, the main bad guy, played by Stephen Dorff, is slightly formulaic, slightly by the numbers. There's nothing special necessarily about that villain, nothing necessarily bad about the villain, but nothing that makes you go, "Oh, how is Blade going to overcome this?" In that same vein as we can see in perhaps other movies where there is a main villain. And that kind of leads me on a little bit onto why I think Blade 2 is slightly better. Not massively better, admittedly. And again, it's not to say that Blade 1 is a bad movie, because it's not. It's a great movie, but I think Blade 2 just kind of pushes what we like about Blade 1 and just pushes it a little bit further and takes it into a slightly different direction that doesn't feel totally devoid and totally departuring from that first movie. But before I get into that, let's have a little look at the budget and the box office reception, those kinds of things that we always like to kind of talk about in our episodes. So the first film, Blade, August 21st, 1998. So right at the latter stages of the 90s. It feels very much like a 90s movie. And it was made with a budget of $45 million, which for a relatively new approach to comic book movies, because I think a lot of people would, at the time, probably didn't know that it was a comic book movie, because it didn't feel like what we know about a comic book movie. Obviously, in the UK it's rated 18, but over in the States it's rated R. It doesn't really have all the hallmarks of what we know about a comic book movie. It was kind of an innovative approach at the time. It made 17 million on its opening weekend and has a domestic gross of 70 million and a worldwide gross of 131 million, which at the time is a really good gross for what is a relatively new character that we hadn't seen a lot in Hollywood at the time. Obviously, it had been in comic books, but I think it's definitely one of the lesser known Marvel characters. As I said previously, I don't think a lot of people, other than seeing that Marvel logo at the beginning of the film, would know that this is, a comic book movie, certainly not at the time. And it had a good score on IMDb of 7.1 out of 10 and a Rotten Tomatoes score of 78%. So a really good first iteration to start off and to really kind of set the franchise on a good footing, on a good trajectory. If we look at Blade 2, March 22nd, 2002, so just under 4 years later than the first film, had a slightly bigger budget of $54 million. In its opening weekend, it made $32 million back. So again, it's made almost double its budget back in almost double the budget of the first film in its opening weekend. Has a domestic gross of 82.3 million, so again slightly bigger than the first film comparatively at the same time, and the worldwide gross had 156.8 million on its worldwide gross, so again slightly bigger again. Now these aren't astonishing numbers in comparison to ones that we've seen before, but what it does say is actually we have a slightly more, it's going in the right direction. It's not necessarily what we would call, a box office surefire hit, but it's certainly going in the right direction. It's making a profit. It's making more than the first film made, without there being too much of a higher budget, only a 9 million difference in the budget. If we look at the IMDb scores and the Rotten Tomatoes scores, again, this is kind of where I was saying earlier, where I thought it was slightly more highly regarded. Has a 6.7 out of 10 for IMDb and an audience score of 68% on Rotten Tomatoes. So whilst the general consensus isn't that this is a better movie, but it's certainly in the same ballpark. It's not a drop-off as we've seen in the past, episodes that we've had a look at, some of the movies that we've spoken about. It's not a massive drop-off. So again, keeping on that same sort of consistent basis, personally, I would put it slightly higher than the first film. And I'm going to go into some of the reasons as to why that is. But if we move on to the film crew now, and we look at the two films in comparison, so the first film was directed by Stephen Norrington, with a script that was written by David S. Goyer, produced by Robert Engelman, Peter Frankfurt, and Wesley Snipes, and the music was composed by Mark Isham, and the cinematographer was Theo van der Sande. So, again, some recognisable names there. David S. Goyer from probably most most famous for working on The Dark Knight, which I mentioned earlier. Yes, again, unfortunately. I'm not going to mention that in every episode, I do promise. But if we look at Blade 2, we have a very familiar director in Guillermo del Toro, using a script that was written by Mary Wolfman, Gene Colan, and David S. Goyer. Produced by Peter Frankfurt, Thomas Kretschy, Patrick J. Palmer, and Wesley Snipes. So again, some continuity from first film to second film with Peter Frankfurt and Wesley Snipes. Composer was Marco Beltrami as opposed to Mark Isham, and the cinematographer was Gabriel Bernstein. So again, some familiar names there. Guillermo del Toro from the Hellboy franchise, Kronos, Mimic, films like that, has a very signature kind of style. And I think it's a style that really does come through in that second film and really does add to what we saw in that first film. If I'm going to just briefly look at the cast here, we've got obviously Wesley Snipes playing Blade, which, to be fair, I could have used that in great castings of all time. I think he's so synonymous with the Blade character. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to kind of top the Blade character, even in the third film, which is very, very flawed and almost a totally terrible movie. The shining light in that is Wesley Snipes playing that Blade character still. But in the first film, we have, as I mentioned earlier, Stephen Dorff playing Deacon Frost. We have Chris Christopherson playing Whistler. We have Nbushi Wright playing Karen. Donald Logue playing Quinn, probably most well known for his role in Gotham most recently. And Udo Kier playing Dragonetti. So some recognisable names there. Some people who have done some credible work in their own right. Good cast. Good jumping off point for a franchise there. If we compare that to Blade 2, which we have Wesley Snipes playing Blade again, that's good. We don't need a recast here. Fantastic, we've managed to keep Wesley Snipes on. We have Chris Christopherson again playing Whistler. Again, very good to keep his character in the fold as well. We have the introduction of Ron Perlman as Reinhardt. Again, Ron Perlman in pretty much anything is a is pretty good for me. We have Leonor Varela playing Nisa, Norman Reedus playing Scud, obviously most well known for his role in The Walking Dead. We have Thomas Kretschmann playing Damascus, and Luke Goss playing Nomak, which is a little bit of a left field choice to play the main antagonist in Blade 2, but one that works, one that, I don't think anybody would say Luke or Matt Goss in any other film is particularly great for those who have seen their interpretation of. I think they do a version of The Craze. I know that Gary and Martin Kemp did. I think Luke and Matt Goss did as well, and it's not very good. So Luke Goss, a bit of a surprise casting here, and a surprise casting that I think works okay. Doesn't necessarily have much to work with in terms of script and character, but he holds his own. So, why do I think that this is a better film, or a slightly better film? Not massively better, but a slightly better film. Well, one of the reasons is what I've just said with Luke Goss. I think he's a bit of a surprise. I mentioned earlier that Stephen Dorff's Deacon Frost is a little bit by the numbers, is a little bit forgettable in that first villainous role. There are memorable moments in that film for his character, yes. However, it does feel a little bit, monster of the week kind of vibes that we get from like shows like the X-Files and Supernatural, where it's just another one in a long-standing number of villains. Whereas I think Nomak actually comes in, and what I said earlier about raising stakes makes the character of Blade feel like he's in peril. When we watch it, we actually feel like a little bit that, how is Blade going to be able to overcome Nomak here? Because he matches the speed and agility of Blade, goes toe to toe with him, whereas Deacon Frost kind of simply done, what we all hate about those bad video games where you have that main villain and then you get to the point where you have to fight him and, he just becomes this massive monster that you just have to, grin and grit your teeth through. All he does is he transforms really into a slightly harder to kill, rather than actually putting Blade to the test. I never felt like in that first film that Blade is in peril. Like we could see Blade die, okay. There's that element of vampires and can they die, etc., etc. But we never actually feel as though, how is Blade going to overcome this? Whereas I do feel like that in the second one. Not massively, obviously. It doesn't venture too far away from that kind of same narrative structure that we see when, we have good guys going up against bad guys. But it certainly is a step in the right direction of actually feeling like, is Blade going to be able to overcome Nomak here? I think as well, because of the fact that he has the speed and agility similar to Blade, the actual choreography of that fight is much better and doesn't need to rely on CGI in the latter stages of the first film that we see with Deacon Frost, where he just simply transforms, as I've mentioned. It's the age-old question that we seem to tackle a lot of the time in our episodes, but CGI over practical effects. I think here all that does is detract away from the character of Deacon Frost in the first film. And because of the agility and the choreography that's put in place for that second film with Deacon Frost, for Nomak, I should say, means that we actually feel like there's, it feels a little bit more like a kung fu movie rather than just, okay, he's just going to, blow him up, or he's just going to, chop his head off, or whatever it may be. So in terms of the climax, we actually have to see Blade work outside of his comfort zone. So the only way really that he can actually start, going up against Nomak is actually to team up with other vampires, which obviously goes against his morals, goes against what he's used to. And so therefore immediately the danger is that much higher than in the previous installment, because we're not only seeing Blade tackle vampires, but we're seeing Blade having to put his trust in vampires who he inherently doesn't trust. So immediately we're thinking, actually, Blade's in quite a lot of danger here. At any point, Reinhardt, played by Ron Perlman, could could turn on him. At any point, any of those other characters could, sacrifice Blade for their own personal gain. And I think because of that, throughout the whole film, it's just putting Blade in a different situation, in a different scenario that we hadn't seen up to that point in that first film. All we had seen is that, that character, every time he came up against a vampire, apart from Nobushi Wright's character Karen, he took them out, whereas here he's having to kind of go against all of his instincts in order to tackle on, the much bigger threat in the movie. And obviously I mentioned earlier about CGI, but the special effects and the makeup of not only Nomad but all of the Reapers is that much interesting to look at. It's not just a pair of fangs and a slightly, pale look. The whole look is completely different. A little bit similar to what we see in later iterations in pop culture, so things like The Strain. If anybody's seen that TV program, very similar look to the vampires in that. It just has a much more interesting premise. It's a lot more interesting to look at as opposed to just humans with pointy teeth. And not that that's a massive criticism of the first film, because we didn't need to see anything more than that. But at that stage in our exploration to the Blade franchise, but with the second film, we needed something more. We couldn't have just had more of the same. I think this is one of the films where we do need to venture in a slightly different direction. We don't just need the same again, but with a slightly bigger budget and a slightly more bigger action set pieces. So, looking at some of the things that actually came across in my research for this film, and actually looking at how this film was put together, kind of goes some way into explaining why this became, in my eyes, a slightly better film. So I think the first thing that kind of happened, and not that this was necessarily a bad thing, but forced the filmmakers to think a little bit differently, is that Stephen Norrington turned down the chance to direct the sequel. So he obviously directed the first film, but he didn't want to come and do another Blade film. So what that meant is that we had to look elsewhere in direction. It wasn't because the movie executives thought he wanted too much money or anything like that. It's just because he didn't want to come along and do another film. So they had to look elsewhere. And so obviously he ended up going with Guillermo del Toro, who, as I've said previously, we know has a very signature kind of style from his previous films up to that point. And whilst it wasn't his first venture into English language films, it's certainly his biggest production of an English language film up to that point. He would later go on to do Hellboy, as I mentioned in last week's episode, but this is the step that Guillermo del Toro had to take in order to get more recognised by US audiences. So comic book artists Mike Mignola and Timothy Bradstreet worked as conceptual artists. So obviously I think they had a hand in the design of those Reapers. So again, there is a common thread from comic book to screen. So it's not just a case of, we're going to make a film based on this comic book and not really have much connection to that source material. So the fact that comic book artists have actually come on and worked as conceptual artists means that it feels immediately much more like a comic book movie rather than just a movie that happens to be based on a comic book. So if we look at, the film and how it was written, David S. Goyer's original idea at this point was to use the character of Morbius as the primary villain. Obviously, unfortunately, most recently interpreted by Jared Leto. Less said about that, the better. Best thing about that film is the dance by Matt Smith. If you know, you know. The rest of that film is entirely forgettable. The less said about Jared Leto, the better. But apparently Marvel rejected that idea because, as we now know, they wanted to make an entirely separate franchise out of Morbius. It took them a while. some 15, 16 years before they actually properly started getting the ball rolling with the Morbius film. But that's essentially why we didn't see Morbius in Blade 2 here. So the story was changed, and obviously we had Jared Nomak created to be used as the primary villain instead, again played by Luke Goss, which I think is played really well by Luke Goss, which again I keep saying, but it was a surprise at the time. We didn't think it was going to be put it this way, if you see Luke Goss in a movie now, or even either side of Blade 2, you probably go, oh, that's not going to be very good, that's going to be straight to DVD release or straight to Blu-ray release. So it's a real surprise. So the general look for Nomak and the Reapers were based off numerous incarnations of drawings by not only Guillermo del Toro, but the concept artists, Mike Mignola and Timothy Bradstreet. But they were primarily based off the mutants from Beneath the Planet of the Apes, which at the time you would not have made that initial connection. But now that we know, we go back and look at Beneath the Planet of the Apes and we look at Blade 2, we can see some similarities there. So there is actually, a little bit of inspiration taken from another well-known franchise. So I mentioned Luke Goss earlier. He had 10 weeks of boxing, karate and combat training to get himself down to 5% body fat. Now again, that's a good commitment to a role which you could just, you could rely on that CGI, that easy and lazy choice to go, well, let's do this in post, let's do CGI on this, let's make this look a certain way. But actually, Luke Goss dedicated himself to becoming, fit for the part, and actually I think that's a real benefit to the overall tone of the film, because it means that those fight scenes can be choreographed, can be worked with two humans and not have to rely on anything else other than a chemistry between the two performers, which luckily I think comes across. Those fight scenes are always really interesting to watch. Again, going back to how much Blade is put in danger, the way that Nomak leaps towards Blade in some of those final fight scenes is really interesting. It's really really dangerous, really cool. It's almost a little bit Planet of the Apes style in the way that we see, apes lunge at each other in some ways. So again, another little way in which Planet of the Apes has influenced this particular production. And I understand that not everybody thinks Blade 2 is a better film than Blade 1. I think it's kind of personal preference for the most part. I don't think many people think that Blade 2 is a bad movie. There may be some. I think Jim may even think it's a bad movie, so we may get his thoughts on this, on that. But I think generally speaking, I think it's a really decent sequel and a really good sequel that, in my mind, just ever so slightly surpasses that original iteration of the Blade character.
Okay, so Arnold, this is what we're gonna do, okay? We're gonna feed you the line.
Right.
And what I want you to do is, I want you to stop, look around the outside of the frame as if you're looking for weak points, and I want you to look back at the officer, do your line, and turn and leave. Okay? You got that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. Grip, we good? We camera rolling? Yeah. Okay. Lights, yeah. And rolling. Action. Okay, feed the line, that's it.
Make it well. You want to wait for the bed over there?
Now, Arnie, look up. That's right, look down the corridor. Dash it, and up, across the top. Down to your left, along the bottom. Perfect. Now lean in and line.
I will be back.
Cut! Okay, Arnie, that's not the line.
Oh, I thought it.
No. Okay, just try it again. Okay.
I will be back.
No, the line.
Yeah, but I thought.
No, the line is "I'll be back."
I
three
will.
Words.
I will be back. I'll.
Take three. Okay, repeat the line.
If you want to wait, there's a bench over there.
Yeah. Left. That's it. Down to the bottom. Yeah. And now your line.
I will be right back.
God damn it! No, it's 3 words.
I will be right back.
Gosh, God. Just do the words the way they're written.
When I do it, it does not sound right to me. It doesn't sound.
I don't care.
It not sound right.
God damn it!
But this is not efficient.
I don't tell you how to fucking act, Arnold. Don't tell me how to fucking write. Okay.
It's not efficient. I'll be back. It's not words.
God.
It's not real words.
Take 4.
There's a line. Take 4. There's a accent.
Yeah, I will be right. I'll be back right now.
No. Can someone see if OJ's still available?
Okay, I think that's right.
So moving on to another film that I think surpasses the work of the original. It goes back to 1978 and George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Obviously a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, also by George A. Romero. I remember the first time I saw Night of the Living Dead, it was that initial kind of adventure into the original kind of zombie movie, and I remember thinking at the time that it was really well put together, really well done for what was, for me, from my perspective, a film from another era, obviously coming out in October of 1968, black and white, which I think adds a real vibe to it. It was a conscious choice. Obviously there were colour films naturally in 1968, so they made the choice to go to black and white. So I think the elements of the first film were things that I really, really liked. I like the whole idea of it being in a very small central location. All takes part mostly in that house. I think it, perhaps one of those first films that kind of really had that, almost phone booth-esque style where it all takes place in a very small central location, doesn't really deviate from that location, and it's more about the characters and how they're dealing with those zombies. As I say, it was the first real mainstream depiction of zombies in Hollywood, as far as I'm aware. Certainly, I haven't seen any zombie films, before that. That black and white element adds a scary atmosphere to this, and again, that small central location really adds to that fear and that again peril. We've used that word quite a lot in this episode, but adds to that danger that we feel for those particular characters. A brave choice at the time to have a black lead in the movie, and not only have a black lead, but also not have a black lead that is filled with stereotypes, filled with racial undertones and things like that. Really just a strong black character in that central move. Again, a very, very bold choice to have that. Now, obviously, about 10 years later, Dawn of the Dead comes about, and it's a very, very different movie. It's not just the same again with volume turned up. It is a very much a very, very different movie. I've only recently seen it, actually, but it's very, very different. I think for me it more hints at makes comments on social undertones and social issues at the time, and looks much more at character rather than it just being a zombie movie. Obviously it is a zombie movie, but I feel that the thing that really has made it stand the test of time is that it's an exploration into mankind more than it is a zombie movie, and I think that's kind of what keeps a lot of audiences coming back for more. Obviously, I'm going to go a bit more into depth as to why I think Dawn of the Dead is slightly better than Night of the Living Dead. But again, let's go back to the budgets and the box office. So, Night of the Living Dead, October 4th, 1968, had a budget of $114,000. So again, very, very small budget. Even at the time, it has a very, very small budget. It made, as far as we're aware, just under $5,500 at the opening weekend, and then it had a domestic gross of $236,000. If we look at the IMDb rating, it has an IMDb rating of 7.8 and a Rotten Tomatoes audience score of 87%. So again, getting into that upper echelons of audience scores, it's held in high regard. And if we compare that to Dawn of the Dead, which was released in 1978, 79, depending on where you are in the world, had a slightly bigger budget, $650,000. And it made back in its domestic gross $159,000. So it didn't make a profit as far as I'm aware. I think a lot of its money has been made in sort of DVD sales and things post it being released in the cinemas. Again, looking at the IMDb ratings, 7.8 again, so it has the same IMDb rating for Night of the Living Dead as it does for Dawn of the Dead, but it does jump up ever so slightly in the Rotten Tomatoes score with 90%. So audiences really, really, really liked this sequel. If anything, a tad more than they did that Night of the Living Dead original. Looking at how the film was made and who made the film, so it was So Night of the Living Dead, that was directed by George A. Romero, and they used a script that was written by John A. Russo and George A. Romero. It was produced by Cole Hardman and Russell Streiner, and the cinematographer was George A. Romero. In the Dawn of the Dead sequel in 1978-79, George A. Romero again reprised his role as director and spent his time writing the script as well, rather than using John A. Russo to help him. And it was produced by Richard P. Rubenstein, and the composers was actually Dario Argento, another well-known horror director in his own right, with his band the Goblins. And the cinematographer was Michael Gornick. So that's who made the film. Now, obviously, I've mentioned a little bit about the social commentary and a little bit about the way that it kind of approaches the way that it approaches telling a story through zombies. Because I think it could be quite easy to just have, an hour and a half or 2 hours of elaborate death scenes with no real kind of through line or narrative to it. But it doesn't do that. It actually shows some really interesting depiction of humans and mankind and how we deal with difficult situations. One of the things it took from the original and turned up a little bit with the volume is it took a central location, for the most part, in that house in the original, and turned it up a little bit by having most of the film take place inside the mall. Now, obviously, we do see how they get there, and we do see other areas, but the thing that or the location that most people seem to remember from this film is the mall. And I think what that does is, again, it just takes what we love about that original, takes it and turns the dial up just ever so slightly, a slightly bigger area, but also means that we have more opportunity to explore those characters and how they're dealing with the situation. So one of the things, again, that I really, really like is the way that we have those 4 central characters, played by David M.G. Stephen, Ken Faree as Peter, Scott Reiniger as Roger, and Galen Ross as Francine. Those 4 central characters really do go through a whirlwind of emotions and a whirlwind of experiences in what feels like a very short space of time in that mall. And it sort of similarly echoes what happens to the characters in the first film. Obviously, Dwayne Jones playing Ben, Judith O'Dea playing Barbara. They're coming to get you, Barbara. That famous line. Cole Hardman, Harry Cooper, Marilyn Eastman as Helen Cooper. Keith Wayne playing Tom, and Judith Ridley playing Judy. It mirrors that in a way, but again, turns the notch up. Past 10, turns it up to 11. Little Spinal Tap reference there. And as I say, gives us an opportunity to see the characters and how they deal with the situation. I think one of the things that I find really interesting in The Dawn of the Dead is how, when they first get into the mall, the first things that they do is they start going, nobody's here, we can take whatever we want. So they begin looting those interesting things, and they leave cash on, they take all the cash from some of the cash registers, and they start enjoying themselves. And I think it's that wonderful depiction of how mankind in those situations where there is a lot of adrenaline, there's a lot of danger, there's a lot of real life and death circumstances, mankind's nature is to find enjoyment and find ways of dealing with that. And I think the way obviously they deal with that is by enjoying the moments that they can. So when we see them go around and looting the places, we even see them begin to start their own very, very small civilization in that mall. They take out all the zombies that they can, and then they start to build their own home in what I believe is the upper areas of the mall. Interestingly, wasn't filmed in the mall, that area. It was a set made by the production staff, but it's just interesting to see those characters and how they deal with that situation. As I say, it could just be an hour and a half to 2 hours of ever increasing elaborate death scenes, which it does do that, but it has this social commentary going along with it and how people deal with it. And I think another way that that's explored is towards the end of the film, where we see that motorcycle gang come in and they storm the mall. I think it's just a great depiction of how humans are inherently destructive. Not to go too deep in our look at social commentary, but inherently there are those who just go in simply to destroy, simply to go in and to cause chaos wherever they can. They could, say, look, I know obviously those scenes where they do kind of reach out to them and say, we need some help, there's only 3 of us. There's that deception and that way that, essentially humans start to turn on each other in those times of need. When really what they should be doing is working together to find a solution. But actually what they do is they start butting heads. You've got the at that point, it's the 3 of them. It's Stephen, Peter, and Francine, because Roger's already died. They're just trying to protect what's theirs, and then the motorcycle gang come in, and they don't immediately trust them. And then it turns out they have every right not to trust them, because they know there's not just 2 or 3 of them. There's more of them. I think one of the things as well that jolts you back to reality, as I mentioned, obviously Roger dies, but when we see him turn into the zombie, it's a jolt back to reality that actually this isn't, all fun and games as they've previously been having. And, there is actually a very dangerous prospect of what can happen to any of these characters if they're not careful. I think it's a really interesting way of making those dangerous and scary moments a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more scary. The way they do that is by having that light relief. It's a much more comical film than the first film. There's a lot more humour in here than there is in that first film. But I think the reason it does that is because it's got to a point where we actually see, as I said previously, how humans deal with those difficult situations. And then all of a sudden, Roger turns and that iconic, grey blue kind of zombie makeup, we see him turn. It's that massive, step back into reality that this isn't all fun and games. At any point, these people could turn. And then obviously slowly we see Stephen become a victim of the zombies. And again, another great way of showing that, and the way that they start to build up some lore in the zombies. So they start saying how, all that, once you turn, all that happens, you go back to your natural instinct, but you have your memories. So we see Stephen start to make his way back to that artificial wall that they put up earlier in the film to keep them safe. We see them break through that, and I think that's very much a metaphor for how the human mind works, in that we put up barriers to protect ourselves. And at any point, those barriers can be broken down, and they're usually broken down by the people who we kind of have the most connection with. Now, I realise that's taken a bit of a jump into some quite deep stuff there. So let's move on into some more facts and information about how Dawn of the Dead was made. So obviously, I mentioned the biker gang earlier, which for those who are avid horror fans will recognise one of them as Tom Savini, who is a well-known special effects makeup artist. He plays the zombie who breaks out of the window in the truck, as well as one of the motorcycle gang members, and is shot by Roger with a revolver. And the scene leaves a bloody smear on the windshield, if you can remember back to that scene. And the effect was apparently created by Savini by throwing himself onto the non-moving truck and spitting a mouthful of blood on the windshield. So a little bit of dedication to his art there from Tom Savini. And as I said, many of the effects were thought of on the spot. Tom Savini created a lot of them. For example, the arm in the blood pressure tester. No preparation whatsoever, literally just on the spot. What can we do? That will look cool. And I think it's that intuitive filmmaking that really comes through. It doesn't feel like a lot of it that it's been over rehearsed, and it's so well thought out that it loses all sense of its organic nature. So I think that's one thing that really does kind of come through in the film. Obviously, there's a need for a lot of extras in the film with a lot of zombies, and apparently they weren't necessarily well compensated for their time. Apparently, they were given $1 in cash, a donut, and a T-shirt adorned with Dawn of the Dead. So, I mean, some ethical questions there when it comes to how much you pay your workers, which obviously is quite hot on the topic with recent ad-astra strikes and things like that. But apparently, whilst writing the script for Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero and John A. Russo contemplated how they should have zombies destroyed. So co-star and makeup artist Marilyn Eastman joked that they could throw pies into their face. And obviously, we know that comes up into into the Dawn of the Dead sequel, obviously there's those scenes where, you know, pies are thrown at the faces of the zombies, and that's kind of a little nod, a little in-joke. So it's obviously there for humour, and it's there to almost pop the people making the film there. Galen Ross, the actress who played Francine, refused to scream during this film because she felt that Fran needed to be a strong female character. So when George A. Romero told her to scream, she refused, and so he never asked again. And I think actually that's one thing that does come through here. Obviously, you know, it's at the time where we're looking at, you know, female characters in movies and how they always seem to be the ones that need saving. It's the damsel in distress, you know, that age-old narrative technique of placing the female in the most danger. But actually, it's little things like this that push our expectations of female characters forward. And I think that comes across. I was expecting, having not seen it, heard good things about the film, but I was expecting there to be that, you know, that screaming woman character who is only there to scream. And it wasn't that. It really was a, you know, very, very pleasant surprise when I watched it. And, you know, I mentioned earlier about it being more comedic, and that was a conscious choice by George A. Romero because he wanted it to be filmed in the style of a comic book. So that was a way in which he'd done that, you know, so he could get those kind of, almost those comic book pictures that he could, you know, really use and express that kind of comic book style in his filmmaking. Going back to the bike gang in the third act of the film, so it was primarily made up of a real gang, apparently, so the pagans. So Savini, you know, mentions that his character wasn't actually written into the script, but it was a character he and George A. Romero just kind of came up with whilst they were making it, and a vast majority of his dialogue as a result was improvised. And again, it goes back to that kind of organic nature and that kind of very intuitive feel to the film, where it doesn't feel over-forced and over-rehearsed, and has a very kind of on-the-spot feel to it, which I think really comes across in this movie. And one thing I just want to leave on with when it comes to Dawn of the Dead is just how influential this movie has been. So obviously I said I haven't seen it until recently, and I'd seen films like Shaun of the Dead and 28 Days Later and things like that, and I never really got how influential this movie was in terms of zombie movies. Obviously I knew it was, but I didn't quite get all of the references. So a couple of things. So one of the things is the music that starts Shaun of the Dead is used from Dawn of the Dead. It's the scene where some of the zombies are making their way towards the helicopter when they first take off from the petrol station. So that, you know, that's how that's influenced there. You know, there's the scene in 28 Days Later where they come across the main characters, Cillian Murphy's character and Brendan Gleeson's character, along with Naomi. I can't remember her name. That's really bad of me. But those central characters, they find an abandoned supermarket and they go shopping, and then Brendan Gleeson leaves the credit card on the checkout desk as they leave. You know, that hints towards that way in which, you know, humans look to have fun. Like I mentioned earlier, it's directly related to and directly influenced by Dawn of the Dead, which I'd never really quite, you know, made that connection before, obviously having never seen it until recently. So in closing, looking at obviously, you know, successful sequels as opposed to less successful sequels, maybe not in terms of budgetary and money and income, but in terms of critical acclaim and audience reception. You know, the common thread for me is not taking what we love about the original or a first iteration of a film, not taking that for granted, building upon the things that worked. So not going, that thing that you love from the first film, well, let's forget about that. We're going to totally disregard that in this new iteration. We're going to do something completely different. I think there are points where you do need to do stuff differently, but not at the risk and at the compromise of other things in the first film that actually worked. Build upon them. Don't treat your audience as if they don't know what they want. You know, I think often sequels will do something differently because that's what they want to do and not think, what does the audience want from this? And so it's difficult sometimes to go, do you add to the original or do you divert away from the original? Is it a fine line? And I think it is, and I think it depends totally on the franchise, totally on what the audience have seen up to that point. I think it is a delicate kind of tightrope to be able to navigate across. And whilst commercial sequels tend to do well, commercially sequels tend to do well, it's usually because of the acclaim that particular film has built up in the first iteration and the relationship that it's built up with its audience. I think sequels will naturally do better because people like familiarity. I think there needs to be a more, as with most films, I think there needs to be more of an approach to what we consider successful. Are movies that make money successful, or are movies that are considered critically and audience reception wise considered successful? And I think there needs to be a little bit of a shift in that, particularly when it comes to sequels.
This message was sponsored by Cactus Energy, coming in our favorite flavors, cactus and cacti. Side effects possible.
There are, I would say, rare examples of sequels to films that are not only great films, but sometimes they surpass the original. So you take a film like Aliens, for example. Probably seems like a foregone conclusion now. Like, it's the Cameron sequel took Ridley Scott's original movie, the space horror movie, took the bones of it, reinvented it into an action movie, and it's the best of the franchise. It's never been bettered, And so looking at it from this vantage point 30, 40 years later, you look at it and it seems obvious that it would work. But if you really think about it, it completely reinvented the franchise, and is often the case, condemned it at the same time. Everything would live in its shadow thereafter. And I can't really picture a studio allowing such a switch to happen to an existing property now. So it may seem obvious in hindsight, but the fact that Aliens exists at all, let alone far surpasses the original, is a miracle. And if you want any evidence of how much of a miracle it is, just ask David Fincher or anyone else who's produced any other Alien film since. Even Scott, when he returned to him with the Prometheus prequels, took it in the shorts, But it can and it does happen. It's not impossible to make great sequels. Logan, just fairly recent cinema history, far surpasses any of the other Wolverine films put together. And Dawn of the Planet of the Apes speaks not only to Matt Reeves' skill as a director, but also, I suspect, his skill at navigating the studio system. And it's no surprise that he then went on to rescue the flailing Batman franchise for Warner Brothers. And we live in a world of what seems like endless sequels and reboots and reimaginings. We talk about it a lot on this podcast. But how many of them ever really have paid off? And yet we all live in hope. Each time a sequel, reboot, or whatever gets mooted or announced, that old familiar internal dance starts again. like the excitement that gives way to like the forbidding feelings of caution, which turns to dread, and then maybe acceptance. You know, you want it to be good. You hope this time they've learnt their lessons. But if experience has taught you anything, it's to start managing your expectations right now. You know, as I record this, Beetlejuice 2 is in the can and set for release. It's, you know, a sequel. If not 36 years in the making, it's at least 36 years in the waiting. And like, I can't help but ask myself the question, you know, as much as I hope it's a good movie, how confident am I that it's not going to suck? That it's not just going to either be some sort of retread or just pastiche of itself, like living off its former glory, you know? Like, they say a good movie is like catching lightning in a bottle. And I would say a good sequel is like catching lightning in a bottle in the middle of a shitstorm. You know, there's so much turd flying about. The odds are stacked against you capturing anything in that bottle that isn't just pure effluent, you know. A pooey, watered down version of what we all like to start with. It's a poison chalice. We all hope, we all want good sequels. We all like more of what we like. We rarely get it. We're rarely happy. You know, Thoreau once famously wrote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, but none more so than your average Star Wars fan."
Brought to you by Cactus Energy, the only energy drink to keep you up all night long. Side effects possible.
Current job vacancies at Amity Island this month. We are currently recruiting for a new sheriff at Amity Sheriff Station. Candidates will be smart of appearance and have some policing knowledge. Job role will include all things sheriffy, and some shark murder may be necessary. Also hiring at Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop, looking for new captain due to loss of previous candidate due to mega shark munching. Please apply within Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop, south of the pier.
Unfortunately, it's that time where we have to end the episode. Thanks very much for listening. Don't forget to like, follow and subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts from. Also head over to our social media platforms to stay all up to date with everything Bury Our Bones with Cinema. So for today, I've been Ryan Etherington, he's been Jimmy Murphy, and we have been Bury Our Bones with Cinema. And it will be a one-button job. Boom, 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 toom, toom, toom.
I have a terrible tendency to just scroll the back and if you're talking, when we're doing it, I still find it slightly distracting.
It's a bit weird, but I think it's a bit weird, but I suppose...
maybe if you listen to it back, see if it sounds... I was like, I'm going to have to stop it. You listen to it back,
well, wasn't it?